When we first started working on taking our multi-container application and importing it into the world of Kubernetes a couple sections ago, I had told you that we were going to create one separate configuration file for every object that you see in this diagram right here. I think in total we had something like 11 or so. So that means that we're going to have 11 separate files sitting inside of this K8s directory, and each one of those separate files is going to create a separate piece or a separate object that's going to be running inside of our overall cluster. Now, at some point in time, it might seem like having to work with all of these different configuration files might be a little bit overwhelming. Everything that we've done up to this point has very clearly said that we're going to make a separate file for each object. But if it feels like that's just too many files for you to have to kind of manage and deal with, I want to tell you about one different way in which you can organize all of these different configuration files. So, rather than putting a separate file for every separate object we create, we can actually combine different sets of configuration down into a single file. So as an alternative way of organizing your config files, rather than saying, okay, I need a file for cluster IP and a file for deployment, we actually can create one single file that contains all the configuration for both a cluster IP or a service and the deployment that it is associated with. There's no limit to the number of different pieces of config that we can stick into a single file, so you do not necessarily have to say, oh, this service is going to be in the same file as this deployment. We could just as easily say one single file is going to hold all the config for both these services and both these deployments. I'm going to give you a very quick example of how you would combine these different config files together, and then I'll tell you why we are not doing that inside this course. Okay, so let's say, for example, that we want to kind of co-locate all the configuration for our deployments and services that are tied to each one. So in other words, we might want to kind of consolidate the server cluster IP service and the server deployment config files down to one single file. So to do so, I could create a new file inside my K8s directory, and I'll call it something like, I don't know, server config or something like that. So serverconfig.yaml. Then inside of here, I'm going to go back over to my deployment for the server. I'm going to copy this entire thing, and then I'll paste it inside of the server config file that I just created. And then likewise, I'm going to go back over to the cluster IP service for the server that we just put together a second ago. I'll copy this entire thing, and I'll pull it over to the serverconfig.yaml file. And then down at the very bottom here, I'm going to put down // or not slashes, but dashes, I suppose. So 3 dashes in a row like so. And then after that, I can paste in all the configuration for the other object that I'm trying to create. So essentially, anytime that you want to kind of condense down all this config and put multiple objects worth of configuration inside of a single file, you're just going to paste everything inside of here and separate each one with the -- like so. Now, for some of you watching this video, you might think, oh, that's great. I can make a single file that houses everything that's related to this piece of my application right here. But others of you might be thinking, well, how would I ever know where the configuration for this service is located? I would have to very actively understand that every service is tied to the related deployment. Now, that's really a question of preference. You don't have to co-locate all this configuration. I personally think that it makes a ton of sense to separate all the configuration out into separate files, as we are doing right now, because it very clearly tells you how many different objects exist in your entire cluster, and the naming scheme that we're using right now also makes it extremely clear where the configuration for any given object can be found. For example, if you put this diagram or a diagram like this right here inside the README of your project, and another engineer comes and works on your project and says, oh, I need to change a port related to the cluster IP service for the multi-client pod, they could very easily look at your list of config files right here and say, okay, client cluster IP service, well, of course, the configuration for that thing is going to be inside this file. And they instantly know where to look to find the configuration for any given object. If it wasn't for that, if you had combined everything into kind of single files or condensed everything down, they would have to understand that this cluster IP service and the deployment for the multi-client pods are in the same file. And so you would have to have some naming terminology for all of your config files that makes it really clear that some particular file contains all the configuration for the multi-client pods, its deployment, and the service related to it as well. And so it's a little bit harder to come up with a naming scheme or a naming convention that makes it really clear that, hey, everything related to multi-client is inside of like XYZ file. Now, that's just my take. As I said, half of you might think that combining this stuff down into a single file makes a lot of sense, and the other half of you might think, no, that doesn't make any sense at all. I want to do everything inside of separate files. So like I said, I prefer to keep everything in separate files, but for you, totally up to you. Of course, throughout the rest of this course, I really recommend that you follow the same strategy as I and use a separate config file for each separate object. Okay, so that's my spiel on combining together config. Now I am going to delete the server config YAML file I just created because I had only made that as a very quick example to show you how to combine stuff together. So I'm going to make sure that I delete that file, and I'm now left with just 4 configuration files, the 2 client ones and the 2 server ones. All right, so let's take a quick pause right here and continue in the next section with our next piece of configuration.